Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into the Sabaton history for Panzer Battalion. I just did the reaction for the song Panzer Battalion in the last day or two, so if you haven't seen that yet, I'll put the link to it somewhere up top. Um, Also, there's a bunch of history stuff that I'm working on. Literally, there's like 4 different history series. I'm hoping to get another video out today of one of those history ones, but we'll see. It depends on how busy I get. But with all that being said, let's get into it. Sabaton History, Panzer Battalion.
I'm Indy Nidell,
And I'm Pat from Sabaton.
and this is Sabaton History. When coalition forces led by the United States attacked Iraq in 2003, it was mainly armored cavalry that did the heavy lifting.
And Panzer Battalion became the first ever song in the Sabaton history about war history.
September 11th, 2001 changed the way the United States perceived its role in the world. The end of the Cold War had brought an illusion of lasting peace and security over the West, an illusion that was shattered as civilian planes were turned into weapons. On September 20th, U.S. President George W. Bush addressed the American nation, emphasizing that the new war on terror would begin with those behind the attack, the terrorist groups of al-Qaeda. But it would not end until those who harbored terrorists and assisted or enabled them had been defeated all over the world. The Bush Doctrine transformed the national military strategy from limited peacekeeping missions to full-on war with boots on the ground on foreign soil. The war in Afghanistan that began in October ended in the complete defeat of the conventional Taliban militia in a short time. But this was just a first step, and also served as a training ground for preparation and mobilization, which the U.S. would need, for example, to defeat Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. Since the Gulf War in the early 1990s, the U.S. military presence safeguarded Kuwait against Iraqi aggression. But by March 2003, it would be the jumping-off point for a full invasion. By the 20th, the ultimatum for Saddam Hussein and his sons to exit Iraq had expired. Operation Iraqi Freedom, with its rather lofty goal of establishing a democratic, peaceful, and prosperous Iraq free from the oppression of the Ba'athist regime, was to begin.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of things. One, like I mentioned the other day, this is pretty recent. Historians normally don't touch on stuff that is this recent, right? Normally they like to have a stretch of time in there before going back and looking at stuff. There's a lot of reasons for that. The politics could still exist, the emotions of the situation could still exist. Basically, historians generally want to be free from bias or from even external pressures about what they should say or shouldn't say or whatever about this. So, already I'm going into it trying to be pretty careful about how I talk about all this stuff, right? The reference to essentially the whole idea behind the quote unquote Bush doctrine here, that it wasn't just to go get the terrorists behind 9/11, but it was to essentially wipe out the system and the countries that created the system that make these terrorists, right? One of the US's, I wouldn't say closest, but one of the countries that the U.S. really, really, really helps in terms of economics, in terms of military aid, all that sort of stuff, is Saudi Arabia. And if we're going to be honest and have an honest conversation about where where some of this comes from, it would be completely disingenuous to just skip over Saudi Arabia as if they don't play a role in it, right? That's one thing. the other thing is, they're really so 9/11 definitely changed the perspective and thought process of the U.S., particularly in a geopolitical sense, right? And actually, interestingly enough, I feel like Europe is going through that right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think they had been in kind of a lackadaisical state, and they got revved up really quickly when the invasion of Ukraine started. However, there was really there was no way that a conventional army of the Middle East, of any of the countries of the Middle East, particularly ones that aren't backed by the US, were going to, this was not going to be a back and forth war. This was going to be the US comes in and steamrolls Iraq. But if we all study history, right? We do this kind of, at least as a hobby. Sometimes regimes that are kind of brutal when this is with hindsight, right? Sometimes those regimes do a pretty good job at kind of keeping a bunch of different groups from just exploding at each other, right? And you see this a lot more with ancient history when you look at, say, an Assyria or somewhere like that, where there are a lot of different tribes and ethnic groups and stuff in the surrounding regions that would literally be just at each other's throats all the time. But they aren't, because Assyria, it basically has their boot on their neck, right? I feel like that's kind of the way Saddam was for the region in Iraq, right? Is there any question that he was a terrible dictator? No, I don't feel like there is. But is it an overall net positive that iron fist is gone? I'm not really sure. So the U.S. has had to learn this lesson in a lot of hard ways. And I feel like they should be at the point now where they should be able to understand that these regime change wars have a lot of unintended consequences that veer way out of whatever they're thinking the initial goal is. So, as you can see, I'm a little on the fence about this, to say the least. But, yeah, as far as just a straight up war, there was no way the Iraqi military was going to be able to hold up against the U.S. military. In fact, in the Middle East, we've seen it's far more successful for non-conventional or guerrilla-type forces. They have way more success against the U.S. than conventional Middle Eastern militaries do.
Under the sun, no shadows will fall. Fierce in our eyes as we charge. Unarmored battalion on course to the east. Close in the end of its march.
On the 20th, U.S. forces, supported by a coalition contingent from Australia, Great Britain, and Poland, advanced. The ultimate objective was Baghdad. Surprise attacks by Tomahawk missiles to kill Saddam and his high command had failed in the nights before, but this was all just the beginning of a new age of warfare. The classic industrial age had been overturned by the new age of information-based warfare. Battlefields were observed through digital links, and units and missiles were guided by global positioning systems, GPS. This was all something new. First blood was drawn at the Talil Air Base and An Nasiriyah, close to the Euphrates River. Would the Iraqi forces sell themselves dearly with determined and disciplined resistance, or would they surrender and run in the face of overwhelming opposition? Well, Iraqi high command was very much aware that they would stand no chance straight up against American tanks in the open desert. Instead, they had planned for a wide defense in depth with dispersed strongpoints all over the Green Line, which ran straight through the country. The most effective Iraqi defenses were placed along the highways and in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which the coalition forces would have to use to advance quickly. Most Iraqi soldiers stood by their colors initially, engaging the invaders with the weapons available to them. But there was only so much they could do with with ancient T-62 tanks against modern A-10 Warthogs and bunker-busting battle tanks.
Yeah, again, I talked about this the other day, but the A-10 Warthogs really did work in the initial invasion stage for the Iraq War. They were monsters whenever the invasion first started. A-10s are close ground support. A lot of people think they have outlived their usefulness, and to be completely honest, I kind of do too, if you're fighting a modern military. The Iraqis were not a modern military. What you were doing in Afghanistan, that was not a modern military. And so they can be supremely effective in that role. But against a modern military, I don't think they would have a ton of use.
And with a minimal air force, they suffered terrible losses the night of shock and awe, March 22nd. The full might of the coalition air force descended on Iraq's command centers, air defense systems, and missile and artillery batteries. All throughout the country, explosions flared from the cruise missiles fired by the warships in the Persian Gulf. The immediate Iraqi response was to fire theater ballistic missiles and surface-to-surface missiles towards the invading force and into Kuwait. However, the air defense net of Patriot batteries from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia and Turkey was worth the money and blew 100% of those missiles straight out of the air before they could do any harm. The coalition was worried, though, about a chemical attack. You may remember one major reason why the U.S. had attacked Iraq was the belief that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, actually, let me hold off. I want to hear what he has to say about this.
And now, as the regime was on the verge of collapse, it would surely use them, right? The second wild card was the host of irregular forces. The Ba'ath Party militia, and especially the fanatical Saddam Fedayeen, Saddam's martyrs, may have been only poorly trained and mostly equipped with Kalashnikovs and rocket-propelled grenades, but their fanaticism was cause for concern. American soldiers soon began complaining that they could not separate the guerrilla fighters from the civilians since they wore no uniforms.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a big part of guerrilla warfare, right? Is that the soldiers, quote unquote, can go in and out of civilian population. The civilian population can help the guerrilla forces in very unique ways because you can't really tell them apart. As far as the WMDs, the longer time goes on, the more evidence that comes out that the WMD thing just was not honest, right? And I mean, that's me putting it as mildly as possible. And so the idea that there was going to be some huge chemical weapon attack, it's hard for me to get behind that.
The guerrillas had stashed munitions around the big cities, in schools and in mosques, hoping to draw the attackers into the teeth of a popular army. Others, like the Al-Qud militia, the youth organization Lions of Saddam, and non-Iraqi volunteers, would be equally dangerous in their fanaticism, if not in their military value. They wore no uniforms either, and they hid in hospitals and schools, communicating via low-power radios and simple cell phones. On March 23rd, Iraq's defense stiffened. The regular army was fortifying strongpoints all over the country while irregulars were gathering in the city streets, or they attacked the long lines of coalition supply columns. Task Force Tarawa lost 18 men trapped in an open engagement, while the 507th Maintenance Company ran into a hail of fire with 11 killed and 16 captured. Now, I have to say that the story of the Iraq War is still brought to us from a Western perspective. A full and cohesive Iraqi perspective is, to my knowledge, still lacking. But it is easy to say here that the Iraqi casualties were disproportionately higher during the invasion.
This time we're here to finish a job started a decade ago. Driving the animals out of their holes, imputing them 6 feet below.
The Americans used their combined arms doctrine to the fullest. It was a systematic approach to envelop cities and strongpoints from both sides, leaving it to airstrikes and attack helicopters to soften up the defenses before the armor engaged. Hunter-killer teams of Bradley and M1 tanks, outfitted with superior fire control and night and thermal vision, fired deadly combinations of sabot and heat shells into enemy armor. Hellfire missiles marked headquarters for F-15 pilots to take out, all while more mobile reconnaissance troops and Humvees continuously pushed on. Supported by informers within the city, often taxi drivers on mobile phones, special ops troops made surgical strikes against Ba'ath Party buildings. In the south, UK forces were isolating Basra, taking heavy fire from the Irregular Forces hiding inside the city. Kurdish Peshmerga forces were operating in the north, trying to draw Iraqi forces away, while special ops were securing key airfields, military facilities, and missile batteries. It became clear, though, that all along the Green Line, they were facing an army that was prepared to fight asymmetrically. Snipers and machine gunners lay in ambush. Mines and explosives were hidden along the roads. Rocket launchers were fired from civilian buildings. Mortar pits and heavy guns mounted on pickup trucks took the advancing columns under fire. Republican death squads forced civilians to fight at gunpoint, forcing them out into the streets where they met certain deaths. There were suicidal attacks with RPGs and trucks against tanks. Even the elite Republican Guard, the proud Nebuchadnezzar, Medea, and Al-Nida divisions, never truly stood a chance. From the 25th to the 29th, the move northward continued. The big cities were isolated until aggressive armored patrols, like the British demonstrated in Basra, could take them from the irregulars. Consuming 2 million gallons of fuel a day, the main bulk of the invasion force continued on towards Baghdad. All in all, a distance comparable to that from the Normandy beaches to the bridges on the Rhine. They established a cordon around Baghdad and prepared for the assault. Again, American high command was unsure how this would play out. Would the civilians cooperate and cheer for the collapse of Saddam's regime? Or would their enemies fight to the last from house to house, intending to inflict as many casualties on the coalition as possible? What was Baghdad a trap or a hollow shell? There was only one way to find out.
Yeah, they certainly didn't go about it in the way that, say, Ukraine has gone about it, where basically everybody has picked up a gun and is fighting. It definitely was not that sort of thing. But there were a lot of irregulars. There were a lot of guerrilla forces, that sort of thing, which, like I said, I feel like that's the best way to fight a military like this. I feel like if you fight them in a conventional warfare way, that's not the move, right? I mean, you have to have a ton of manpower and really a ton of outside help if you're going to do something like that in the modern day. And depending on where you are geographically and how much of that help you get and all that, it still may not be enough. It's just, it's a different sort of thing. And with the fighting, go look at some of the battles that happened in Iraq after the fall of Saddam. After Iraq was quote-unquote taken, go look at some of the battles for cities and stuff after that. They are brutal. They are brutal. And so, yes, even though the initial invasion is successful, you would say, the fight definitely did not end there.
On April 7th, the Marine Corps prepared a Thunder Run. An armored unit, what other nations might call a Panzer Battalion, would rapidly advance into the city and find out firsthand how the Iraqis would react. That day, all while Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, aka Baghdad Bob, the Iraqi information minister, was claiming that no American infidels would ever set foot inside Baghdad, the Marine Corps was heading into downtown. Nearly unopposed, they drove through the streets, straight to the heart of Saddam Hussein's regime. But they did not turn back and get support. Instead, they chose to remain, and thus ended a siege before it even began. After a while, the Iraqi people came out of their houses and began, indeed, cheering for the coalition troops. They came so close that the Americans had to rely on interpreters on loudspeakers to get the crowd to calm down. At Al Firdos Square, the people gathered around a huge statue of Saddam, tying a noose around its neck and pounding it with sledgehammers. An American recovery vehicle finally brought it down. Now, one American soldier put an American flag around the statue's head, but the Iraqis protested, and not wanting to look like an occupation force, the Americans agreed and were handed an Iraqi flag, one without the writing on it that Saddam had introduced. It was a symbol that his regime was at its end and that the people of Iraq were about to determine their own future. The fighting would continue for weeks in the north and even just a few blocks away in Baghdad, as Marines there were already engaged in a tenacious firefight. The counterinsurgency would soon become worse, and the post-invasion tale of Iraq is anything but a fairy tale of nation building. But that was the future. For the song Panzer Battalion came out on Sabaton's Primo Victoria album, recorded in 2004 and released in 2005. And for this moment, the Iraq War seemed to be over and won. On May 1st, 2003, President Bush declared on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, mission accomplished.
Cannot outrun our Panzer Battalion.
Yeah, the initial invasion goes about as well as it could. I mean, they have issues here and there, but in general, for the big, the bulk of the military, it went really well. Iraq, after the initial invasion, turns into an absolute shit show. And you have foreign fighters and you have guerrilla forces, and it turns into a complete mess. And because the U.S. had the idea of quote-unquote nation building, these countries that, into a democracy, they were funneling a ton of money into a place like Iraq. Well, that money, in a system that is, in total chaos, it ends up going to 1 million different places and to 1 million different people. And there are certainly statistics that argue that the influx of money actually made the overall problem worse and not better.
Now, that's really interesting because, everybody who knows you associates you with military history of one way or another. So this is the very first one.
Everything has a beginning and everything has an end.
Okay, let's not talk about the last one, though.
No.
But how did it come around? I mean, how did you, tell us the story.
So first of all, Sabaton is not the first band in history that writes songs with a military topic about war.
Sure.
There has been plenty of them before us. It's a recording we did in 2003. And the song Panzer Battalion, before we even entered the studio, we had been practicing it and stuff like that. But when we had recorded it, it was in the same recording session as we made Primo Victoria, actually.
All right, okay.
And together with those two songs, it definitely changed the whole sound of Sabaton.
Really?
Before that, we were the metalizer, we were that kind of sound, those type of songs. But when we came with Panzer Battalion and Primo Victoria, everything for Sabaton changed completely. Originally, the album Primo Victoria was supposed to be called Panzer Battalion. It was supposed to be the title track of that album.
I guess.
However, when we sent it away to record labels and we were like, this is the artwork we want. So it was my old friend who also designed the Sabaton logotype. He did the first cover artwork for Panzer Battalion.
Panzer Battalion. Okay.
And
what was it?
tanks.
Okay. Never could have guessed that.
So he did this artwork and we sent it away to the record label, who said, no, wait, you cannot do that. Guys, you are playing melodic heavy metal. When you make an album look like that, with a title like Panzer Battalion, people are gonna say that you are a German trash metal band. And we can't really give you that approach. So we need something different. So Primo Victoria became the prominent song of the album, which obviously was a better choice in the
And
end.
that's because that's like is Sabaton.
Yes.
If you did an album now that was Tanks and Tanks for the German label, that you'd be able to get away with it now without being considered that.
Today, yes. I mean, nowadays Sabaton is known as a band who sings about these kind of topics, and
Sure.
people know what to expect when Sabaton release a new album. But nobody had any clue in
Neither you didn't have any clue.
2004 when we had compiled our first real proper album, except for Metalizer. But nobody knew what to expect from Sabaton.
Right.
Okay, here is an album about stories from war.
So this would be, of course, the first song written for that album. Was Primo Victoria just after that, or were there other things between them?
The first demo contained 3 songs.
Okay.
And it was Panzer Battalion. It was the song Night Child,
Oh yeah, sure. Sure.
who we later rewrote to Purple Heart. And it was the song Primo Victoria. So these 3 songs compiled to a demo, which
Yeah.
still was under the name of Panzer Battalion.
Okay.
It was manufactured in as little as, I think, 10 copies. And I sent them to 10 different record labels. Maybe, for many years, Nuclear Blast has been our partner as a record label.
Yeah.
And obviously, they were one of those that we sent these demos to.
Yeah.
I have a letter from them saying that your music is not interesting.
Nuclear Blast. So,
Some
that's
years
brilliant.
later, I think
When
they
did you
changed their
sign with them?
mind.
When did you sign with them later?
We signed with Nuclear Blast in 2009.
Okay, so 5 years later, basically.
5 years later, they changed their mind.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing for us that they did. 'cause
And they
otherwise-
released the songs that they first denied.
Aha. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The story of Panzer Battalion, the first military history song written by Sabaton. So that's it for today for Sabaton History.
Okay, so that was Sabaton History's Panzer Battalion. Sorry if I kind of strung out what I was trying to say through certain parts of it. Like I said, I'm trying to be very careful how I reference some of this more recent and more controversial stuff. But that was a good one. You know, the Sabaton histories are always great. So go support Sabaton. Obviously, they do awesome stuff. But yeah, that was a good one. The whole story is an interesting one, and I think when people down the road, say 100, 150 years from now, look back and study this in history, I think we'll have a lot more perspective and context about some of the decisions that were made that seem questionable, right? But as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I'll see you all next time.